So it's a great pleasure and privilege to have a chance to talk to my former PhD examiner, David Parkin. David, when and where were you born?
I was born in Watford, north of London, in 1940.
1940. And anthropologists are interested in kinship and sometimes go back over their, at least to their grandparents' generations. Did you know anything about your grandparents?
Grandparents I did know something about, yeah.
Yep.
And one member of my family did try and trace back one side, on my mother's side. There's some interesting results.
So what were your grandparents like?
What were my
grandparents like?
Grandparents like? Yes, well, on my father's side, my paternal grandfather was actually a Freemason, but kept all that secret, so none of us really knew what it was about. My grandmother was his wife, very loving and caring. And on the other side, my grandfather, that's my mother's father, was in fact had an interesting life. He once went to Los Angeles with Charlie Chaplin, and the family knew Charlie Chaplin quite well. And he was in a circus, this was a very long time ago. He used to box kangaroos. That was my maternal grandfather.
Good training for an anthropologist.
Tough man. And my grandmother was interesting. She married up initially, and then was widowed, and then married my grandfather. So,
what were their occupations apart from circus?
Well, he became a carpenter. Yes, he was quite good at carpentry. And the paternal grandfather, he was a tea buyer, used to buy tea and travel around. He worked for Brook Bonds.
So they were both in England?
They were both in England, yes. Yes, they had no, apart from this trip to Los Angeles for the circus, neither. And of course, both of them fought in the First World War. My paternal grandfather was wounded at the Battle of the Somme, but only marginally. In fact, it probably was a blessing because it got him out of it. And my maternal grandfather fought in Greece, Thessalonica, I think it was.
So we're moving down to your parental generation. What were the characters and occupations of your parents?
Parents. Well, my father worked as a company secretary for various companies after serving in the Second World War, with some distinction, I think. And my mother, basically a housewife, looked after the family in the days when women did this sort of thing.
What were they like as people?
My parents were extremely tolerant, fair, liberal, not to the point of negligence, but they let me do what I wanted to do, I've often thought about this and look back with gratitude that I was allowed to do what I wanted to do. And they never pushed me, actually. My paternal grandfather pushed me a little bit, but not my parents, and I think it helped actually find what I wanted to do.
What did you want to do at the early age?
At the earliest age, that's a good question. I think probably acting.
Really?
Yes.
When you were a child?
Yes, very early on. Probably seeing Hollywood movies or something as well. As a child, it was always a very special treat, I think. In those days, it's a long time ago, to see a movie. There weren't too many of them around. And so I became interested in acting. And primary school did act a little. Of course, at secondary school it stopped. But I think it found its way through when I gave lectures, lecture in anthropology.
Useful art for a lecturer. Were there any other hobbies when you were very small, or any memories of your first sort of 6 or 7 years before you went to your preparatory school?
6, 7 years, not really, no. I mean, a fairly bland life, I think. Trying.
Living whereabouts?
Living in Watford.
Watford.
Which I did until quite late, in fact. I became interested in sport. It was absolutely hopeless at primary school. I took an interest and vainly tried to play cricket and football. It's always rejected. And it wasn't until I was in secondary school that the bits and pieces of the body came together miraculously so that I could be sufficiently coordinated to play these games.
So where was your first school that you remember?
Well, it was first primary school was a local primary school, and I stayed at that until I went to grammar school in Watford, and I stayed at that school until university.
Were there any teachers at your first school that you recall with horror or pleasure?
There were a couple, yeah. There was one called Tommy Tucker, who was very kindly disposed and seemed to think that I was bright enough to be worth encouraging. You must remember these were, well, the notional class size was 48, but sometimes it had to be doubled up to 96.
Good heavens.
Because there weren't enough teachers. This is after all from 1945 onwards. And a couple of us managed to get to grammar school out of that 96 cohort for 1 year. Only two of us. And this one teacher was very encouraging. And there was another teacher who was also quite encouraging.
What subject did Tommy Tucker?
Well, primary school was basically 3 hours. I mean, these are, very down-at-heel local schools which were struggling in the aftermath of the Second World War. But dedicated teachers. Many of them were not fully trained. There was such a dearth, as you know, of teachers in Britain at that time that people returning from the army were, provided they'd got shown some skills in some department, other than pulling triggers, were drafted in.
And then you went on to Watford Grammar School.
And I went on to Watford Grammar School,
Was that a good school?
It was a brilliant school, absolutely wonderful. I mean, the grammar schools are often, I suppose in a way, quite rightly regarded as elitist. It was part of that brought about their downfall, but they were a fantastic opportunity for people like me. And it was a great school, and the schoolmasters, as they were called, were dedicated. And I suppose it had the trappings of an independent school. They wore gowns. It might have been an independent school, I know, before it was turned into grammar school. And they all had degrees from university, and wore waterboards on special occasions. And we played good sports, I mean, with very competitive schools within the kind of North London, Hertfordshire area. It was a great school.
Did you play against Welwyn Garden City? Was that somewhere?
Yes, Welwyn was one of them. Haberdashers' Asks. I think it was Bushy Grammar, Berkhamsted. What was the Freemasons?
St Albans?
Yes, I think we did play St Albans.
Because
yes.
of course
yes,
Jack Goody and Colin Renfrew both went, I think, to St Albans Grammar School.
Yes, we did play them. Yes.
A bit earlier.
Yes.
And what subjects were beginning to attract your interest by then?
Well, that's a good question. There was always a tension, I suppose, between science and languages, and unfortunately those days you couldn't do a bit of both. You had to choose either languages or what I suppose we'd call humanities now, or science subjects, or with maths. So I suppose it was more or less decided for me that I would do languages, and so I did, as well as English, of course.
Were you good at languages?
Yeah, I was good. Yeah, French, German, and some Spanish.
And you've always been interested in linguistics. Sorry? You've always been interested.
Yes, I've always been interested in language use and in linguistics. Yes, from a very early age, and just enjoyed language learning.
Did your parents take you abroad at that time, or?
No, they didn't. No, but my father had, because he'd been in the Second World War, he quite extraordinarily had managed to learn French and German without any school, not much of a school background in those languages, but he had actually, while serving in the armed forces, picked up. And I think that was an influence to hear him speaking French, and even a little bit of German. You know, that parental template, if parents can do it, then you should be able to do it.
And were there any particular teachers then who you remember, either by name?
Yes, well, I suppose the grammar school, the most notable would be the headmaster, a chap called Harry Ray, who was an extraordinary man. He was in fact a French resistance fighter, and was honoured for this, but never spoke about it, and very much kept it very much to himself. But it was common knowledge that he'd served in the resistance. And he came to the school as I did. As I started, he started. Extraordinary man, inspiring, quite unusual educational methods. He then went on to become Professor of Education at York University in this country after I'd left. And he was particularly... There was another teacher, a chap called Taffy Hughes, as he was called then, obviously from Wales, another incredible man, who was the one actually who directed me into the subject I took at university.
What was his subject?
he was economics and economic history, but he was very perceptive, and he looked at all the boys in the sixth form. It was an all-boys school, I should have mentioned that, I suppose, and seemed to be able to match them to their likely future successes, the sorts of subjects they should be taking at university, rather than what they were doing. And in my case, for instance, I thought that I'd continue in the modern languages stream and do German and Russian at university. But he said I shouldn't. I should, by all means, keep the languages up, but do something else. And it was this man, David Hughes, and indeed the headmaster, Harry Ray, both of them, drew to my attention the School of Oriental African Studies, which was just opening up to undergraduates at that time. This was, well, when I went to SOAS, it was 1959. I think they'd had one or maybe two intakes of undergraduates, so they'd only really just started. And they had various degrees and offer. One of them was an African Studies degree, as it was called, which combined anthropology, which was taught at the LSE, with Bantu languages or any kind of African group of languages. In my case, it was Swahili with kind of Bantu linguistics. And they showed me this brochure, which I thought was fantastic, very exotic. And of course, like any boy of that age, you know, you're yearning to get out and about and travel the world. And this seemed to be a route, as indeed it proved to be.
Just to finish off on school, were there other things? You mentioned sport.
Yes.
You began to become reasonable.
As I say, the bits and pieces of the body miraculously came together. I became quite coordinated and played cricket. And I played first for the Colts, and then the second 11, then the first 11. And it became a passion. I mean, I think it's almost a passion now, actually.
Is it?
I never lose a moment. I'm trying to follow up on scores. Cricket. Rugby, I could only survive as a scrum half in the early years when the size differentials were not too great. By the time it got to the sixth form, I was obviously so small in relation to the other boys that I was a bit of a bad bet. So I gave up rugby, or it gave me up. And so I ran and did athletics instead. But cricket was really the mainstay of the sporting.
What about acting? Did you continue with that?
No, I didn't. No, curiously. No, I think that's possibly because there wasn't any provision for it in secondary school. There was quite a macho element at the school. It was a good school, but there was a certain macho element. I think that acting in those days would have been seen as something we do extramurally and not within the school.
What about music?
Music, I learned the clarinet and played in the orchestra. And kept that up for a while, and eventually, like many of these things, I eventually gave it up.
Has music continued to mean much to you?
Yes.
And what sort of music do you like?
Well, I suppose if I say all forms of classical music, that sounds a bit bland. I suppose 18th century music in particular.
Mozart, Handel,
Yes,
Bach.
Yes. But I'm interested in most forms of classical music.
And other sort of jazz, pop music.
And jazz, yes. I've got quite a collection of jazz discs. And
Do you work to music, or can you not work with music on?
Yes, I can only work to music, but not to music and words. So opera's out when I work, but anything else is in.
And you've done quite a lot of work on religion later in your life. Were your parents, did they have any religious affiliation? Or?
Well, my mother was Catholic, of partially Irish background, and she remained a Catholic all her life. She didn't go every Sunday or anything, but it was obviously always a relevant feature of her life. My father wasn't especially a believer or active, but he was a Protestant background. His father, my paternal grandfather, was religious, and certainly my paternal grandmother was. So I was from a mixed religious background, Protestant and Catholic. And I suppose my mother in particular encouraged me at least to think religiously But as I said earlier, she wasn't, neither of my parents were in any sense punitive if I didn't do what they told me to do. So she took a fairly relaxed attitude. But I did go to church until I was about 15, I think it was.
Were you confirmed or?
Yes, I was confirmed. I sang in a choir.
And then did you just drift away, or did you have some anti-reaction to it?
At the age of 15, I realised that I couldn't accept these beliefs. So there's a fairly radical break.
And how would you characterise your subsequent religious beliefs up till now?
I suppose I'm a rational humanist or something like that. If that's a bit of a cop-out. It's, I find myself quite annoyed, I suppose, by dedicated religious affiliation. But it gives a lot of comfort to some people, so I must be tolerant.
Do you ever feel, sometimes I feel it's strange that some of the great anthropologists should be Catholics, like Evans Pritchard and so on, your predecessor in Oxford, because they could both see the universal and yet they could stick with their particular version so confidently. Does that strike you as odd, or?
Yes, it has struck me. Yes, indeed, yes. I mean, I do find it difficult, really, for people to subscribe to organised religion when they are also anthropologists. I can understand, I suppose, a belief in some kind of transcendental force, which of course you can then ascribe to physics or some branch of modern science. You don't have to anthropomorphise it. But I do find it difficult that people like Evans Pritchard and Pocock,
Mary Douglas,
and the Leonhards,
Victor Turner
did apparently believe in what the Catholic Church ordained. If it is the case that they really did believe that, or whether there are other factors at work. And I've never really been able to understand what the rationale is.
They sometimes argue that it's their very Catholicism and feeling for religion and having felt it inside them that makes them and Jewish anthropologists particularly good in discerning how religion works. Do you think there's anything in that argument?
Yes, I can understand that. Yes, I think it's very tempting as well. There is a sense in which the aesthetics and the non-rational converge. Sometimes the only way in which you can reconcile yourself to that sphere of inexplicable occurrences is by appeal to some higher force. But on the whole, I've resisted this. Preferring to see it as something we don't yet know about. So in that sense, I suppose you could say I'm agnostic rather than atheist.
Yes, that's what I was probing towards, So let's go to SOAS. What was SOAS like in 1959? Who was there?
SOAS was an extraordinary place, I have to say. And the very first, in fact, even the interview when I first went there, it was April before the October or whenever, I was just captivated by the place. All these people from different backgrounds and different continents of the world.
It was in Connaught Square then, was it? Or?
It was, well, it is, the main building was where it is now, but the anthropology department was in 27 Woburn Square.
Yes, which is where I knew it. Yeah.
Which is where you knew it. But the people who were there, well, as I said earlier, language, like African languages were taught at SOAS at that time, and anthropology was taught at the LSE for the most part. Nevertheless, the Department of Anthropology at SOAS did have anthropologists. It had Christoph Schreiner, of course, Adrian Mayer, Michael Mendelssohn, and I think by then F.G. Bailey. But as undergraduates, for reasons I've never entirely understood, we were taught at the LSE for the first couple of years. It was really only in the third year that I was taught regularly by one of the SOAS anthropology teachers. In fact, it used to be said, I think at the time, that the anthropologists at SOAS had a rather good time of it, because they had virtually no students, whereas the LSE had lots. And of course, subsequently, there was a decision that SOAS should teach its own students, and the LSE should teach its own students. But I was lucky in the sense in which I had the privilege of having lectures and some seminars at the hands of people like Maurice Friedman, Raymond Firth, Isaac Shapiro. Burton Benedict, Lucy Mayer, and that was fantastic. It was Firth and Friedman in particular were great lecturers, and one or two seminars, Friedman and Firth, I recall, and also as Darrell Ford was at UCL, and though I didn't have really formal teaching at UCL, there were one or two lectures I could go to. But then in the third year at SOAS, I came under the wing of F.G. Bailey, Freddie Bailey. And he was certainly a very formative influence. I've often felt that I've never been able to thank him enough for that, but maybe the time will come. He taught me to write English for a start.
Seems late in your career to learn that minor skill, but...
Well, you see, before then, and no doubt since, it was long, endless sentences without paragraphs. But he taught me the virtues of short sentences. No, but seriously, he was someone. He had extraordinary clarity, and at the time he'd just written, I think it was called "Caste in the Economic Frontier," which was a Marxist analysis of caste mobility in Orissa, in India. And not only was it clearly written, so I could understand it, it seemed to me to be an entry into, if you like, a form of Marxism, which was you could actually study as an anthropologist. It was not terribly theoretical, and yet clearly was an instance of the economic shaping, or if you like, determining the socio-cultural, indeed the political. So that was an eye-opener, and subsequently he was a very good teacher. I didn't get to know Adrian Mayer curiously until afterwards, until I became a lecturer. Nor indeed even Christoph. Both of whom later, of course, were very important.
Bailey later wrote quite a lot of pretty almost cynical but certainly deep analyses of academic and other politics. And
That's right.
So someone who doesn't know him might think he was a rather cynical and suspicious sort of character.
Yes.
But was he like that?
In those days, I think it was more like a clinical attitude. He had this capacity to analyse a situation very quickly and get to the raw bones of a situation, or indeed of a person. He could size them up in no time at all, at least so it seemed to myself and my fellow students. It's true that later on, yes, he developed this, what you might call Machiavellian approach to society and produced all these books, but this largely came after I knew him. So I knew him in the days when he was still interested in, should we say, more larger social issues.
It's sometimes said that in the Oriental and African term described of SOAS, that the Oriental tended to predominate, certainly in the anthropology department, and Africa was rather secondary to that. Was that the case when you were there?
Yes, definitely, yes. Yes, well, Africa in the early days was only represented actually by someone called George Huntingford, who was a former Kenya settler, and I'm afraid had the attitudes that went with many, not all, such settlers. But he did have an extraordinary knowledge of the material culture of some of the so-called Paranilos, or Nilo-Hammers, as they used to be called, Kipsigis in particular. And that's what he used to teach. He used to teach material culture in Eastern Africa. He did actually have a great scholarly knowledge, and I know that John Middleton admired his scholarship a great deal. So it was a bit of a paradox. He was a man who would not be your best friend because of his, should we say, his racial views, but who was nevertheless a scholar to be admired. So he was the only Africanist, but that was later remedied, though after I'd ceased being a student, by the arrival of Philip Gulliver, who obviously had a big influence whilst he was there.
So we've moved to a quieter spot, David, just to tell the audience what we're doing. The people you've mentioned, I mean, coming back to this point about Oriental and African, I mean, Christoph was India, Adrian was India, and Thailand. Freddie Bailey was India. So within the department, it was mainly Oriental.
That's right. As indeed SOAS had a very strong, SOAS as a whole had a very strong Indian orientation.
Yep. Just on the LSE side, you mentioned Morris and Friedman and Raymond Firth as good lecturers. Was there anyone in the LSE at that time who particularly you got to know or influenced you theoretically?
Theoretically, not theoretically, no. No, that's an interesting question, actually. I mean, I suppose the lectures were very much aimed at explaining a trend in anthropology and then criticising it. But it tended to be fitted to the syllabus. And maybe some people would disapprove of that. I remember a current colleague of mine used to refer to such lectures as spoon feeding. But there were more than that, actually. It did engage the student. After all, we were undergraduates and we wanted to be given some guidance. And so Friedman in particular was an extraordinary exponent of kinship. In fact, little aside to mention that he used to give his lectures on kinship at 10 o'clock, Wednesdays I think it was. We would troop along, packed house. And then he decided to have a series of lectures next term called Advanced Kinship, but at 9 o'clock. Now, even in the London of those days, it was still difficult to get in from quite a way out, as most people were lodging a distance from the college. But again, it was a packed house. He was such an inspiring lecturer, and as I say, there was no evident theoretical orientation. I don't think one would associate that with Morris Friedman particularly, but he was a tremendous scholar, had read and researched his sources and was able to present them in a way that was challenging and made us want to run off and read what he'd been talking about. So I think that probably was what one would expect at that level. Possibly F.G. Bailey later influenced me theoretically. But the theoretical influences really, I think, came from reading, and in fact it was really the interest in complex society, which sounds very old hat now, but 1950s, early 60s, there was still, I suppose, a lot of concern about how much we should be studying rural societies and how much we should be looking at polyethnic, complex urban situations. And I tended to plump for the latter, which is what I eventually did for my doctoral study. I actually studied the town. There were already, of course, there was the so-called Roselington School, Manchester Roselington School, where some very fine studies and monographs have been published. And so I followed that route. People like Earl Epstein and Clyde Mitchell and Max Gluckman, of course. So if there was a theoretical influence, it really came via studies of complex societies. And I suppose of all those Manchester Roselington people, mainly Gluckman. So yes, this influence came from outside London, really, in the form of the Manchester Roselington School. And I've often referred to that school in my own writings, at least the earlier stuff.
Did you know Gluckman at all?
Yes, I got to know him, yes, quite late in the day.
What was he like?
Extraordinary man, as everyone will have told you already. I met him first properly. I think I'd met him briefly, but met him first actually in Zambia. It was a conference in the early about 1971 or 2 or something of that kind, and I'd been invited to this conference. And he was there, and he decided we should take a trip to Barotseland, which was fantastic, you can imagine. So we travelled. It was a little difficult because it was the time of Smith's declaration of UDI for what was then Southern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. And so matters were a little tense. We were, after all, European. We were treated okay, but there were some one or two, tense incidents, even in Zambia, and certainly on the border with Zimbabwe. There were. But he was a very outspoken, forthright person and had very pronounced views, and I could see why he was such a dominant figure at Manchester, and part of me wishes that I'd spent some time under him, but not all that much time. I think perhaps it was the best of both worlds to have him at a distance. But I did admire him theoretically. No one ever refers to him now, of course. But I maintain to this day that his famous article on the Zulu social situation in Zululand written and published in 1940, believe it or not, is still one of the best, if you like, works on methodology that I know in anthropology. As a starting point for analysing situation. You take a situation, a crisis situation, and from that crisis situation, principles and affiliations reveal themselves. And so I've always used it myself, and I've always got my students to use it. It never fails.
It led into the famous social drama approaches.
Right, exactly. Yes, Victor Turner and others. I mean, so I do think that we owe Gluckman a great deal. Sometimes I'm a little disappointed that very few people speak of him, or even have heard of him in many cases, because his work is not taught. And I suppose that may be because much of his influence was through personal advice. It is in his writings, but perhaps you have to dig it out rather more.
Were you doing, I mean, you were now living away from the outskirts of London, Watford, and now in central London, presumably, or were you commuting from home? Or
when I was in London, yes, that's right. I used to, when I was at SOAS, what level, a student level or?
A student level, yes.
Yes. Oh no, I lived in London as a student.
And were you doing other things? Were you playing jazz or?
Yes.
Having a social time?
Yeah. It was, well, I played the clarinet, as I mentioned before, and we used to have traditional jazz bands. Pretty awful.
So, at the end of your undergraduate course, you had decided you really liked anthropology, presumably?
Yes, I wanted to continue.
And how did you continue?
Well, in a sense, I was lucky because having done this effective double honours degree in Swahili Bantu linguistics on the one hand and anthropology on the other, I was equipped for not only for the anthropology but also to take an interest in language shift and to use the language. In fact, because there were quite a large number of Swahili speakers living in London and working for Bush House for the BBC, I got to know these people quite well during my years as an undergraduate. And by the end of the undergraduate degree, I was able to speak Swahili quite well. We were very well taught, all credit to our teachers. But I could speak Swahili before I'd gone to East Africa. So that when I went to East Africa, I spoke this very coastal form of Swahili, because that's what the people in London spoke, coastal Swahili. So when I fetched up in Kampala in Uganda, where they don't speak that kind of Swahili, they thought it very odd that I should be speaking, and insisted I came from the East African coast. So I had to adjust my Swahili in due course.
But was it easy to get on to, I presume this was a PhD or something?
Yes.
You got funding?
Yes, I got what's called still is, I believe, a Commonwealth scholarship. I was also offered one of the usual doctoral awards offered by I suppose it must have been the Department of Education those days. But you couldn't have both. And the Commonwealth scholarship was much more generous. And so I took that. I dare say, yes, I think that was the right decision to take the Commonwealth scholarship.
Was there any fieldwork training, which we are exhorted to do nowadays?
No, it's amazing, actually. I tell you, I finished my degree sometime in June, and before I knew the result, I was actually in Kampala doing fieldwork. Because the Commonwealth scholarship said I had to be there by the beginning of the Makeri, so Uganda Makeri, term, which was in July, because initially I had to be registered as an external London student because it was Makeri University College. So I had to get there by July, so I didn't actually know what class of degree I had. And I certainly had no fieldwork training at all.
Those were the good old days. Do you remember this is the first time you'd been to Africa?
Well, the first time, I'd been to North Africa.
Had you? Yeah.
Yes.
But do you remember that sort of first arrival scene
in Kampala? I do remember, yes. I remember us flying over Lake Victoria, as it was then known, and landing, because we came by plane rather than by boat, and then being driven along in a bus to Makeri University. And that was the introduction, if you like, to a very optimistic Uganda. Independence was only about a year or two away, and their spirits were high. And it was southern Uganda, which was in those days quite prosperous through cotton and coffee growing. And it was delightful. And Makerere University College seemed to be new. In fact, it wasn't that new, but the buildings seemed to be new. And that spirit of optimism pervaded the university, the students. One couldn't have wished for a better setting. I mean, I do think I was very lucky, actually, at that point in time. But the actual fieldwork, I mean, because as I told you, I decided I wanted to study the town, and the town, or the part of the town, was going to be Kampala itself, which is the capital of Uganda, or at least the main town of Uganda. And Aidan Southall was already there, and he had published a few years previously a book on parts of East Kampala, and I wanted to do a follow-up study because his was a very detailed ethnographic survey, and that was fine. It laid the grounds for something perhaps a bit more politically charged, because nationalism was just around nationalism was in the air, Kenyans as against Ugandans, as against Tanzanians. And nationhood was being granted first to Uganda, then to Tanzania and Kenya. And so I wanted to look at the forms of urban migration and settlement in the context of the expectations that independence would bring. And that was going to be the theme of the study.
And was it the theme of the study?
It was, yeah. It remained the theme. There were inevitably things which I didn't anticipate. And one of these was that I went to Kampala using the lingua franca, which was Swahili. That was fine. But I was almost literally captured by the Kenyan migrant ethnic group, the Luo, who are Nilotic peoples, and therefore related to the Nua. Dinka, of course, the so-called southern Nilotes rather than the northern Nilotes. And they had this reputation. Aidan Southall had written about it, though I hadn't realised at the time. They had this reputation for welcoming foreigners, outsiders, which they did. And they more or less insisted that I also learn some Luo, which I did to an elementary standard at first. I had to work in it much later. And so, though the study was indeed of a polyethnic urban migrant community and the extent to which it was able to settle in this area of Kampala, it was also, without my entirely controlling it, an emerging study of the Luo.
Which you went on to.
Which I went on.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you summarise the sort of, very briefly, the sort of outcomes of the research, what the main conclusions? Because this was, as you said, quite pioneering research on urban anthropology.
Yes.
Do you?
Yes, going back to Gluckman, I'd been struck by yet another one of his methodological pieces of advice, which was that, if you remember the famous phrase, an African townsman is a townsman, or an African miner is a miner, what he wanted to say, and I think he was absolutely right in saying it, one mustn't presuppose that urban migrant communities are affected by their rural, traditional, ethnic backgrounds, the so-called tribal backgrounds as they were called. That you couldn't start your analysis of a town by looking at the individual differences of custom. That you had to take first and foremost the fact that they were involved in corporate organisations like mines, or in housing areas where they had common problems. So it was the common problems that should be the starting point. And I certainly accept that to this very day as the right methodological starting point. But it became very clear to me, however, that while that was true, the people in Kampala were people living in Kampala, with the problems of what it was to live in Kampala. It was also very clear that the so-called rural, traditional, customary backgrounds were vitally important in shaping the way they would interact not only with each other, but with the authorities and politically, cross-cut, of course, by these issues of emerging nationalism. So while it was a good starting point, that's Luxman's advice, it was also clear that, in fact, so-called custom was, or differences of custom, were vital in, as it were, reshaping the way in which these constituent ethnic units interacted with each other in town. So that became, in a sense, the overarching theoretical theme. So it was not turning like one on its head, but saying, you're right so far, but actually, once we've established that, ethnic differences do count for a lot. Of course, it was at a time when I think this was still being recognised and perhaps hadn't been fully appreciated. And of course, it's a whole question of what one means by ethnic differences and whether they're really shaped by other factors. This we know.
Would you say, I mean, it's a crude question, but would you say you enjoyed your fieldwork, or were you very lonely, or were you very confused, or was it the usual mixture of these things?
I certainly was pretty confused at times, yes, not quite knowing what all this data was going to amount to. I mean, I suppose we paint with broad sweeps of the brush, and I think if I'd realised that at the time, I wouldn't have been so concerned. But I think I found it difficult to reconcile all the detail with something which had to be written up at some stage. Did I enjoy it? Parts of it. Yes, I suppose so. I was never lonely. I was lucky in being captured, as I say, by these Lure. They are a very welcoming people. Difficult to make generalisations of that kind, of course, but certainly that was my impression. Maybe it's because they were themselves migrants, but I think it was more than that. And so I was never lonely. There was always plenty of company. Yes. That was the question.
Yes, that's. Who was Aidan your supervisor, or was he?
Aidan was my external supervisor. That's right, yes.
And who was your internal?
Well, I didn't have one when I left. So I was just as one in preparation. But eventually it became Philip Galvin.
Oh, right.
But Aidan was there actually in the field. He is himself a remarkable person, as you know.
Yes, tell me something about him.
Well, Aidan is certainly one of my heroes. He was one of the few, I think, who went out to Africa. He went out to Africa in 1946, to Macquarie, in fact. And he stayed there continuously until, I think, 1964. And then took up posts in America, but still came back to Uganda quite a lot. But this meant that he'd had, nearly 20 years at a time when other anthropologists in Britain would have done their fieldwork and come back to jobs in the UK or perhaps gone to America. He stayed on. And being linguistically very gifted, it meant that he knew various Nilotic dialects. I mean, his command of Alur, which is a Nilotic language, very close to Toro, the language I knew. His command was absolutely extraordinary. But he also learned Luganda. He could speak Swahili. He knew other varieties of Nilotic dialects apart from Alur. And at the same time, because Francophone communauté was still in evidence in the conference, he spoke French as well. So he had all these linguistic qualities, which of course I much admire, being interested in language myself. He was a man of few words, probably even fewer then than later. And insofar as I could see him about my work, it would be perhaps once every 3 months. And not much was said. I mean, I would do the talking, nervously at first, and then later on relaxing. And he didn't say much, but at the end of it all, he would say one thing. And that one thing would register, and it would be crucial. So I suppose the bits of advice probably didn't amount to more than about 6 or so, but they were all very important in the shaping of the thesis.
And what was Philip like as a supervisor when you came back?
Philip, we formed a friendship on the basis of squash. He's a very good squash player, and though he was 20 years older than me, and I wasn't that unfit, I was not a bad player myself, he's more than held his own. There were times when he would beat me, and it was pretty evenly fought out on the squash court. So much of our conversation consisted of anthropology generally, over a beer, or perhaps in the morning over a coffee, in between squash games. But we never actually discussed my thesis. And not because he's not capable, not because he wasn't generous, but I think he felt that an urban situation was not something he could really say anything about. He himself had done this fieldwork in quite remote places, Karamoja, Turkana, in very difficult, physically very difficult conditions, and it was quite different from the study of a town. So I think it was quite fairly clear that he didn't really feel he could. So, but we talked generally about anthropology, if not about my thesis. I did give him a draft of the thesis to look at, and he altered the spelling of one word. I spelled superseded with two S's. Or did I spell it with a C instead of an S?
Crucial change, but
yes.
minor.
But to this very day, he remains a friend.
When you came back, you came back to SOAS and wrote up your thesis. Were there any contemporaries of yours at SOAS you remember or who went on in anthropology or anything?
Yes. Well, of course, our mutual friend Lionel Kaplan, who became a very close buddy, very dear friend, and then of course she was then Pat Bailey, who became Pat Kaplan, who worked for among Swahili herself, and also became very linguistically gifted in that language and in French. There was Janet Fitton, also a Swahili, so she was more based at LSE initially and then came over to SOAS. And then she also married someone called Abdullah Budra, who worked in Yemen, who was also a very close friend, who was at SOAS, who was, first language was Swahili, but Arabic was a very close second language. He was himself Kenyan Arab. So these are the people that come to mind immediately as being direct contemporaries.
Was there much social life among the postgraduates at that time? I mean, did you used to all go out and drink together or socialise, or was it a rather lonely existence writing up your
Yes,
thesis?
I think more lonely than... Yes.
So were there sort of writing up later, and so as there was this tradition of you had to pass around 3 of your chapters for people to comment on, but that may not have been...
Not then, no. It was one was very much left. Yes, it was quite lonely. Yes, you're quite right. It was Adrian Mayer, who introduced this system to which you refer of writing up sessions and exchanges, but not at that time. No.
This was beginning to be the time when people were suddenly halfway through their PhDs offered jobs. Was this the case with you? Or?
I'm afraid so. Yes, yes. I hadn't finished it. And I was offered a job it was advertised as a research fellowship, and I had just come back from East Africa. I'd only been back a few weeks, in fact, when the job came up almost immediately, and I was about a year off submitting the thesis. So I applied for the research fellowship, assuming that would allow me to do research, to finish the thesis and go on to the next project. But they then told me, in the way that institutions in those days did tell me, that it was now to be a lectureship, but that they wouldn't affect my research anyway, because after all, you only become an anthropologist to do research. This was in the days when SOAS in particular was very research-oriented. And, to give an example of that, incidentally, I remember when I came back in 1964, from my doctoral research. I was then appointed as a lecturer, and 2 years later, 1966, I was back in the field. But I'd been urged to do so by Christoph Schreiner, who, after I'd only been back from the field for 1 year, said, "My dear, it is time you go back to the field. You've been here for a whole year. What are you doing in London?" Which is wonderful, of course. You were actually, as it were, urged to go and study.
So it was at SOAS that you were offered this lectureship?
Yes, I should have said that. Yes.
Yeah.
SOAS, yes.
So you started your lectureship in 1964?
1964, that's right.
And you were more or less, you were the second Africanist, as it were, at SOAS. Because Philip was there.
Philip was there, that's right. Hunting Philip had left by then, of course. I think he hadn't left by then. So I would have been the third Africanist. Hunting Philip hadn't quite yet retired. So.
And was Abner Cohen there by then?
Abner Cohen came a bit later. I can't remember when he came. No, I have to correct myself there. No, Abner was there, I think also in some research capacity. Yes, so there were 4 of us. Yes. And you mentioned Abner. Of course, Abner became a tremendous influence.
In what way?
Well, he was carving out for himself a very, I suppose he would call it Mancunian approach, though it was sufficiently distinctive for him to have the right to call it his own approach to politics, and it's, of course, summarised in his book, Two-Dimensional Man, and also one or two articles in which he tries to look at, if you like, what he later denied was a dialectic, but which seemed to need to be a kind of dialectic between symbolic field of relations on the one hand and political-economic order on the other. And I certainly at the time, and I know Lionel Kaplan, who both were very much influenced by this, and also by his sheer imagination. So, yes, he was there. And Zayas as a whole, I think, prospered very much from his presence.
This was a time of great turbulence anthropologically, because it was the two sort of the double prongs of Marxism and structuralism from France were coming in. Were you influenced by either or both of those?
Well, I was partially influenced by what people said about Marxism. I suppose I wish I'd paid rather more attention to it, but I always had this struggle between Weber and Marx. Aspects of both seemed to be relevant, and I wrote a book called Palms, Wine and Witnesses in 1972, which revealed that tension. I thought it, and others have said it. But the Marxist influence actually came from my roommate, Stefan Feuchtwahl,
who I interviewed last week.
And I shared a room with Stefan, and I found him quite inspiring at times. It was great to have someone like that in the room. I mean, normally one doesn't want rooms shared, but this happened to be an unexpected bonus. And so he was full of ideas and energy, and very outspoken. And these were qualities I certainly appreciated. And so I learned quite a lot, I think, about, if you like, Marxism. And of course at UCL there were various people also interested, but it seemed to be very diverse. And if you rounded up all the Marxists at that time in one room and asked them what Marxism was, it would seem you'd get different answers. It was obviously a subject both opening up and yet not entirely well coordinated. But it was certainly an important moment.
And structuralism?
And French structuralism, that came later, I think, for me, if one means in particular the influence of Lévi-Strauss. Probably when I spent a year or two at Sussex University and met David Pocock. Those were some very interesting exchanges. Was
that Pocock through Dumont's work?
Yeah. It wasn't that David Pocock was like an unswerving admirer of Lévi-Strauss, but he certainly seemed to be able to pick out from Lévi-Strauss ideas that might be of interest. And so I did take an interest in structuralism at that point, but that wasn't until the early 70s. And at the same time I became interested more thoroughly, not just in language use, which I'd always been interested, but in linguistics. I mean, obviously the two would go together. So early 70s, yes, linguistics, structural linguistics in particular. Read into that, and we had people at Zayas who could actually lecture on this.
This is now getting into the avancement of the late 60s, when I was at the LSE in Vietnam and the student movement and so on. Did that affect SOAS much?
The événement, les événements. Yes, it did very much. Yeah, yes, it did. That was I think that's one of the hardest times in my life. Very much. Yes, we had difficulties, both within the school and in relationship to outside institutions. And the students were often divided themselves. There were sit-ins, of course, lockouts, lots of recriminations, many of them misunderstood, really. The wrong people being accused. It was certainly a difficult time.
Where were you? I mean, you stayed. I mean, two of my friends, David Seddon and Stefan, both left at that point.
Yes.
And Christoph was reputedly quite with the
Quite
established.
Yes, well, Abigail and I both felt that that was not really entirely clear. My own view is that Christoph sympathised much more with Stefan than people give him credit for. As you know, as I think it's well known that I tried to defend Stefan and came out in favour of him. There was a special, I suppose you'd call it a tribunal at Zayas, which seemed to be fairly conducted, I must say. But he nevertheless was asked to move. I don't think he was actually given the sack, but I think he was asked to move.
His contract wasn't renewed.
Something of that kind.
So the picture I have from one or two interviews is that the establishment was fairly firm that too much identification with the students and radical thought, and Stefan himself said it was perhaps not a wise thing of his to write an article talking about the imperialism of the SOAS and so on. He himself was partly to blame, for being provocative. I knew Christoph very well, and he always struck me as a very liberal and open-minded person. What was your impression of his role?
Yes, I think that he was caught in a difficult situation. I really don't think that he wanted Stefan to go. I dare say that Stefan may have a different view. I was in a funny sort of situation. I defended Stefan at this tribunal. I'm certain I didn't suffer from doing that. Christoph didn't change his attitude towards me one bit and remained cooperative and courteous. I can only assume, and of course I have no evidence, is that Christoph felt that he was under pressure to adhere to, if you like, an emergent policy along the lines that Stefan suggests, yes.
Well, Stefan said that in some meeting Phillips said, this man has got to go. So he rather pushed the blame onto Phillips rather than Christoph.
Yes. I think that probably Phillips, as the head of the institution, was responsible for policy, and that Christoph was, in a sense, carrying out policy and felt he could do no other. But I have to say that in all my dealings with Christoph, his attitudes, his remarks, it would not suggest to me that he wanted Stefan to go.
And more generally on Christoph, he's a person I personally, having worked on his papers and photographs, enormously admire. But, everyone said he went to sleep in the seminars, which I know is true towards the end, but he also set up SOAS as a very big department. He was a very good administrator earlier on. Yes. What was your assessment of him as an anthropologist or field worker or head of department?
Well, as head of department, he was, in a sense, just what a department needed, in a way, at that point in time, when we weren't subject to interference by government, REE, HEFKE and so on. He let people get on with their work. It suited us. He was especially clever at recruiting and managed to handpick not only some very good anthropologists, if I may say so, but people whose interests were compatible with each other. And yes, he chose some very good people, and I think that it was a very happy department on the whole. There was that, as I said, that fortunate period, but that was the only one. And most of them stayed, most of the people stayed in that department, very few actually left. So Christoph had this ability to build up a department of compatible people who were good anthropologists, and to delegate, and so the administration ran smoothly. I suppose the person to whom he delegated most was Adrian Mayer, who of course later succeeded him, and that was a very safe pair of hands.
And as an anthropologist?
As an anthropologist, it was fairly remote to mind, because I wasn't in those days specifically, particularly interested in India, and he was very much an Indianist. The partial exception to that was his book Morals and Merit, which had a much wider appeal. And I suppose it's one of the few works where he does actually generalise and make some very insightful statements. And is very clearly written. He had this very smooth way of writing. If you ever saw him writing, he wrote by hand, you know, and never ever, to my knowledge, crossed anything out. So what he wrote was what was eventually published. So as a field worker, he was extensive, he was an ethnographer, he's written material that would last forever. I remember at his retirement celebration, he once said, well, I suppose I've never expected anyone to recognise you for my theoretical contribution, but more for my ethnographic. And I suppose that's a fair summary, but of course it's also the kind of material that will last. I mean, his stuff is for all time.
Betty, did you know Betty?
Oh yes, Betty, very well, yes.
She was his rock.
She was his rock, that's right. Yes, she was, if not the power behind the throne, then at least something of a guiding
organiser.
He looked after us all as well.
And an very intelligent woman herself.
Absolutely, yes, in her own right. Full of sound advice.
And you mentioned Adrian, but did you become friends with?
Oh yes. Adrian was pure gold. I mean, in the sense in which he took on the administration. Well, I mean, he stepped in for Christoph when Christoph was actual head at times as well, and it coincided, I suppose, with the emergence of, you know, accountability, if you like, the ethos of accountability, the first stirrings of it at least, and when universities had to be accountable to the authorities, to the taxpayer, if you like, as it was later called. But he also brought in innovations, such as the one you mentioned earlier, the special writing up groups for post-fieldwork doctoral students. And generally, I think, reorganised the place so that it was much more efficient and smoothly running. And he really devoted his whole life to that. And the other good thing about him, of course, was that, though we didn't realise at the time, he took on the whole burden of this, so that the rest of us could, you know, continue to write, do field work and teach. So there was very little administration for the rest of us. Adrian did it all. And I don't think it was until, well, I succeeded him as head of department. It was not until then I realised how much he'd been doing. So, you know, we do have a very special debt of thanks to both those people, actually, Christoph von Führerheimer and Adrian there.